Thank you very much to our artists. So how are we doing? We're good? All right. Well, this is the more formal portion of our program. We will start our live webcasting now. And I, again, want to welcome you this afternoon. One moment. My name is Amber Kerr. I serve as an elected member on the IIC Council, and on behalf of the IIC and our members, we wish to welcome this audience, as well as those who are joining us online, to the Point of the Matter Dialogue, Viral Images. Not that. There we go. Viral Images. Thank you. Exploring the historic and conservation challenges of objects created for social protest and solidarity. Please share your comments, images, or postings with us through the hashtag IICProtestArt, and we hope that you will continue to follow the IIC on our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn social media pages to see the remarks of others and participate in future programming offered through the IIC. Before we begin our program, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background on our organization and the Dialogue series. Founded in 1950, the International Institute for the Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, IIC, is an independent, nonprofit international organization which serves as a forum for professionals responsible for the preservation of cultural heritage. It supports the advancement of knowledge, practice, and standards for the conservation of historic and artistic works through IIC conferences, publications, and events such as today's. In 2008, seeing a need for serious discussions on emerging issues in the modern world and the relationship of those issues to the preservation of cultural heritage, the IIC inaugurated a dialogue series centered on public events to bring together experts from a broad spectrum of disciplines so they could contribute their unique perspectives on a specific topic with a live audience. The first dialogue, Climate Change and Museum Collections, took place during the IIC's 2008 Biennial Congress in London. Subsequent dialogues were held during the 2010 IIC Istanbul Congress, titled Between Home and History, Gentrification versus the Desire to Preserve Places of Historic Value, which are neighborhoods. And the 2012 IIC Congress, Not Your Grandmother's Chair, the conservation challenges of decorative and applied arts objects made from experimental materials. And I think we've seen some of those today. These past events are available through transcripts and video recordings on the IIC website, as will today's program. The dialogue series is designed to create a discussion between those who create art and those who promote it, collect it, protect it, and enjoy it. The program series provides a venue for open discussion on current topics between international speakers and the audience. As a nonprofit organization, we are grateful to those who help us make this programming possible through private donations, sponsorships, and donations such as those who contributed to this event through our Just Giving crowdfunding drive and through the purchasing of reserved tickets for this event. So we thank you very much. Your generosity has made it possible to make this event accessible to a broader audience through our web streaming and video archiving. Now, I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Rebecca Rushfield, who will be your moderator for the dialogue. Rebecca?
I want to welcome everyone who is attending the program either in person in this room or remotely online. You're all invited to participate in the discussion. My co-organizer, Amber Kerr, and I want to thank the International Institute for Conservation for its overall support and the individuals whose contributions made the live streaming of the program possible. We are about to begin the 10th dialogue in the IIC series, Viral Images Exploring the Historic and Conservation Challenges of Objects Created for Social Protest and Solidarity. The working title for this event was Umbrellas, Gas Masks, and Post-it Notes, a name which incorporated only a few of the wide variety of materials that are used in social protest and solidarity. An exhibit at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which opened in July 2014 and ran half a year, gave the artifacts of protest and solidarity a new name, Disobedient Art. Disobedient objects are not made with the museum or archive in mind, and their legitimacy does not rest in their inclusion in museum or archival collections. Most of these objects were created to be seen by a wide audience for a moment in time. There's a school of thought that says that these objects should only exist in the moment of their use. When one sees pieces of the Berlin Wall sold on eBay as rare collectibles for investment, one can see a validity to such a point of view. However, I would venture that each person here today believes that these objects have a purpose long after the moment of use. These objects are original sources of history. That is why Harvard University Library maintains the Charlie Archive Collection, and that is why the New York Historical Society created its History Response program, which mobilizes a curatorial team to collect objects from moments of crisis or exhilaration. The number of objects that can be collected from just one event is staggering. Staff at the Robert W. Woodruff Library at Emory University set up a system to download and archive tweets about the Occupy Wall Street movement and harvested more than 5 million tweets from more than 600,000 unique Twitter users. After the recent Women's March, faculty from Northwestern University decided to salvage the handmade signs left behind by the participants in the Boston March. They rented a van and filled it with 1,000 signs left, which now reside in a storage facility waiting to be dealt with in some permanent manner. Archiving this form of cultural heritage presents new challenges for both the collectors and the stewards of these artifacts. With the increased creation and use of objects of social protest and solidarity, it is essential to undertake a serious and formal consideration of their preservation. This dialogue aspires to be a discussion among those who create, promote, collect, and protect these objects. The structure of the program will be as follows. Each panelist will make a 5-minute introductory statement. This will be followed by an hour or so of open discussion in which the panelists will reflect on questions presented by you, the members of the audience. Amber will close the program with a brief summary of the discussion. I want to introduce our panel in the order in which they will present their remarks. Gregory Sholette, founding member of Political Art Documentation Distribution and Associate Professor of Sculpture and co-founder of Social Practice Queens, Queens College, City University of New York. Aaron Bryant, Mellon Curator of Photography at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Lidia Uziel, Head of Western Languages Division and Bibliographer for Western Europe at the Harvard University Library. Ralph Young, Professor of History, Temple University, and I'm not sure if Michael came here. Oh, good. Michael Gould, Wartofsky, sociologist and author, and last but not least, our conservator, Christian Scheidemann, founder of Contemporary Conservation Limited. So, Gregory, you're up.
Thank you. You actually re-francophoned my name. We say Sholette for years now, but it was originally Sholette. I have a few images I wanted to show you. Let's see if we can move forward. So I was a founding member of Political Art Documentation Distribution in 1980, and we basically tried to collect the material you're talking about, put it into an archive. It now rests in Queens in a warehouse which is part of the Museum of Modern Arts and the Museum of Modern Art collection. But some of the things that we did were objects like this, or things like this, an inflatable Uncle Sam Pac-Man, which was used for demonstrations. Now, whatever happened to that actual object, I really have no idea. I show this slide all over the world, and I'm clueless. I'd be curious to know. So it's an interesting question. How would you conserve this? Should you conserve these things? This is another question I think we have to grapple with. We had a newsletter, which you see there. What I wanted to talk about primarily, and then I have a couple of questions I want to raise, was a project in '84. Many of us were living on what we called the Lower East Side, or Loisaide, and it was becoming called East Village, or that was a name that had been around, but it was being used by real estate people to sort of, transform it into obviously a displaced zone. We did a project in the streets of the East Village as the art scene exploded there. So this is roughly between 82 and 86. This was 84 when we did this project. And we had artists make temporary posters and works, or you see down here a street stencil, and we put these up in 4 art galleries that we created 4 art galleries, including Leona Helmsley. This was before she was put in prison for tax evasion. Another gallery, because graffiti art actually became part of the art world during the East Village scene in the 80s. Discount Salon, and you can see Guggenheim downtown. Of course, there was no Guggenheim downtown at that time. Corner of A and B was a poster out of place, Art for the Evicted. And all this went up in the street. This was the opening at the Guggenheim downtown in 1984. And you see some of the artworks on the wall. Now, of course, this was when the East Village was still boarded up buildings. Others were demolished. So this is now a restaurant, a fancy sort of restaurant or bar. But at the time, we could use it as an art gallery. And we spray painted the names of the galleries in each of the 4 locations. We would go and replenish the work because, of course, other people put posters up. So it was like an ecological zone. You have to keep refurbishing it. Oddly enough, and this is the Pad Archive. This is literally the Pad Archive in the Museum of Modern Art Warehouse. The last book I wrote, called Dark Matter, I went there, they gave me access, and I went through all the files and wrote about these various ephemeral projects that are in there. In 98, I was hired by the new museum to be curator of education. It was a brief affair, long story, but one of the things I did was create a show called Urban Encounters. And I invited various art collectives who do largely ephemeral work, street art, et cetera, to be part of the show. Guerrilla Girls was one, Bullet Space was another. The group Godzilla, which was an Asian American art group, was here. But I also invited Repo History, another group that I was part of, and one of our fellow members, Jim Costanzo, AKA Aaron Burr Society, is here today. He almost didn't get through with the horn, ladies and gentlemen. They had a hard time at security. He's also part of Occupy Museums and Gulf Labor, which I'm also part of. But you can see in the background, remember in the street, there was this Monopoly card sign, this enlarged sign by Day Gleason, which talks about rents going up and how the rents keep going up. And the rent prices on this would make you laugh, but they seemed outrageous at the time in '84. And basically, we had to borrow the piece from the Museum of Modern Art. We had to promise we would put out an acid-free backing, frame it correctly, and hang it on the wall, and of course return it to them intact and in careful order. We documented all this. So it's an interesting process from the street, right, to the museum, because they had these in their collection in the Pad Archive, then into a kind of situation in which they had to be treated like art, when they were really functional and sort of meant to be instrumental in that sense, right? Okay, so I just wanted to say really quickly a couple things about that. What is this cycle about? I mean, people are making art in the streets. It really is not intended to be art in an institutional setting or to a fine art or high art setting. Some people who make it may actually have a background in fine art. There's a lot of people who don't. It comes out of social movement culture. The Tea Party is social movement culture. There's also lots of organizations on the left who are sort of, this kind of social movement culture. They're not specifically aiming to be part of a museum collection or part of the art world. So the question might be, what is the narrative in which they connect to one another? And I would think that part of what conservators do, and I'm not one, and I'm speaking to you and those of you who are, is to create narratives about what these objects are, how one might rethink about them over the years, right? Changing perhaps the way they actually were intended, and basically incorporating them into that story that we call art, right? I would make the argument, this is my last point, is that actually all of this kind of street art, the pussy hats and everything else, are essential for the fine art world, for the museum culture. Because without that outside, they could never articulate what is high culture and what is inside. And in that sense, this outsideness, this kind of social movement art, is actually very much at the heart of the high art museum and the high art culture, right? Simultaneously inside and outside. So that would be my proposal. Thank you very much.
Howdy, my name is Aaron Bryant. I'm curator of photography and visual culture at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And in addition to collecting photography. I also focus on LGBTQ collecting as well as contemporary collecting, so looking at current events such as Black Lives Matter. That's when I first started getting involved in collecting for contemporary histories. Today for my presentation, I'm talking more about viral images, and I start out with the images of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and W.E.B. Du Bois here, because when we talk about viral images, particularly in the African American community, it already has a historical context. These are people who understood the power of images and how to disseminate these images along with the message. Frederick Douglass had about 160 photographs of himself, and he talked about the power of photography to offer criticism, particularly criticism against some of the prevailing images that were happening during the mid-19th century, the minstrel images, African Americans stealing chickens, eating watermelons. And what Frederick Douglass believed was that through photography, we can reshape a new image of African Americans that can offer a criticism to some of these prevailing images. And without criticism, there is no social progress. During the Civil War, he did 4 lectures on photography and its importance and the evolution of America and the social progress of the nation. Sojourner Truth took a number of photos. She was an activist, a womanist, and she understood the power of photography in terms of associating dignity and nobility and her message all into one. So she would sell her image to her patrons and supporters, and that's how she was able to support herself, but also pay for the cause, whether it was abolition or women's issues, particularly African American women's issues. And at the bottom of her photograph, she would print, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." Now, this is a play on what photographers would say early on, but what she did was she signified on this. You know, she understood that she was selling the two-dimensionality of herself in order to sell the substance of what she was really all about. And W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, picking up with Frederick Douglass as well. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first, I think it's safe to say he was the first African American to do a photography exhibition. In 1900, Du Bois organized an exhibition for the Paris Exposition. Again, thinking about world fairs during the 19th century, not only do we have minstrel images to deal with, or we have the pseudoscience and pseudo-religion that was publishing books using Christianity and religion as justification for slavery, some of which we have on exhibit at our museum. Books like The Negro a Beast or In the Image of God. So talking about African Americans as beasts. If they're beasts, they don't have souls, and if they don't have souls, then you don't have to treat them equally, and you can treat them like beasts. And so Du Bois organized, and then think about the World's Fairs, of course. At the World Fairs, this is at the height of imperialism, or at the beginning, really, of imperialism and colonialism. And so you would go to these World Fairs, and they would have human zoos. In these zoos, they would have Africans, they would have people from India, Aborigines, Pacific Islanders, people from all over the world. They would just put in these cages for folks to walk around and sort of gawk at them. And they would get them to do tricks. Well, Du Bois said, I'm going to do an exhibition of African Americans at this Paris exposition, and this would be the first photography exhibit of African Americans curated by an African American. And so I start with these folks because they understood the importance of images and how to make them viral, how to use them for social progress. Du Bois, again, using the Crisis magazine later, he becomes one of the founding presidents of the NAACP. He becomes the editor of the Crisis magazine. This is a photograph of, I think it's Valdora Turner. He would do a children's issue every year, and he would talk about the achievements of black children. Again, using the media to create a new image, to make another kind of image viral, because the other image of black children would be the pickaninny. And so he wanted to show something very different. And then, of course, you know, we understand the importance of the FSA photographers. We know Dorothea Lange on the end here. And oddly enough, during the year that this photograph was taken, it was in the 1930s, I think, maybe 1936. It was only published into newspapers. On the other side, we have author Rothstein. But what's amazing about the Dorothea Lange, or all of the FSA photographs, but particularly the Dorothea Lange, is how across generations, across time, we still know the image. The image is viral in a very different kind of sense because there's not even a space to sort of talk about how this image is still prevalent. Here we have Danny Lyons with his famous photograph that became a poster, I think, for the March on Washington, and we see the poster on the side here. Danny Lyons and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, used images very well to create these posters and these flyers that they would distribute. And again, creating a new sense of young activism, young people being able to come together and make a change. And of course, we can think about this in the context of Black lives, decades later. The James Corrales, The Procession. This is another famous photograph that we all are familiar with, we all know, and again, it's viral in a very different sense. It's not just social media viral, but it is at the same time. It's just not social media in the context in which we talk about it. It crosses generations, it crosses time, and what is it about these images? How do we talk about these images in the context of this notion of what is and isn't viral? And of course, we have, even on the right here, we have this publication that came out around shortly after Selma. It was actually written, I think, by a journalist to sort of opponents to the civil rights movement. And so images can be used for good, and they could be used positively, and they can be used negatively. But again, once an image becomes viral, how do you control it to a certain extent? Now, with my collecting with Black Lives Matter, this is a watercolor on paper by an artist named Patrick Campbell. It's called The New Age of Slavery. He originally did this watercolor right after Trayvon Martin. And I think he posted it online, but it didn't get much, it didn't get picked up much by social media. Then right after Ferguson, he posted it again. And then all of a sudden, this image not only goes viral, but it shows up everywhere. If you look in the photograph here, the gentleman with the bandana, he's wearing it on his T-shirt. It shows up in posters. It shows up in protest signs. This becomes an icon of the movement to a great extent. And I think we might have some details where you can see within the stripes we have lynchings. So he's placing this within a historical context. And then if you look within the stars, you have these different figures, people pleading for their life, people running, being shot in the back. And again, he actually created this, I believe, for Trayvon Martin, but it doesn't pick up speed. So why, after Ferguson, does it become viral when it didn't become viral after the Trayvon Martin case? This photograph is by Sheila Pre-Bright. It's another, something else that I collected. I've collected most of these, actually. I think they're all from our collection except for the Dorothea Lange. But Sheila Pre-Bright with Black Lives Matter. Again, the notion of what goes viral, we talk about Black Lives Matter, but we don't talk about it in the context or its connection to Trans Lives Matter and LGBTQ issues. The founders of Black Lives Matter are all people who are involved in many different kinds of social protests, including gender-related and sexual orientation-related protests. This photograph here is by Zun Lee. It shows in the middle a casket, and this also became an icon of, if you see the mirrored casket there, it became an icon of the Ferguson movement. This was taken during Ferguson. October would have been the weekend that folks from all over the world would have come to protest outside of the police station. And then, of course, we all know Devin Allen from Protest in Baltimore. And these are some of his images that went viral. His story is incredible because he was a photographer for only 2 years. He was an amateur photographer. You look at the images there, absolutely amazing compositionally. And he just went out in the street, took these photographs, and within a week and a few days, he was on the cover of Time magazine because his images had gone viral. He posted on Instagram, all of a sudden they're being picked up by Ice Cube, Rihanna, JayZ. Folks like that are starting to tweet and share his images, and then within a week, he's on the cover of Time. So that's sort of my introduction to what I do.
You'll all find longer biographies of the speakers and the artists and the filmmakers in the program.
Hello everyone, my name is Lidia Uziel and I am the head of the Western Languages Division at Harvard Library. My unit at Harvard, we are responsible for collecting materials that originate from Western European and English-speaking countries, and collecting materials that document current socio-political events in many countries in Western Europe and in English-speaking countries is part of our responsibilities. Since March 2015, we have been building the Charlie Archive at the Harvard Library, an archive that includes materials produced in the aftermath of very tragic events that happened in France in January 2015, terrorist attacks that happened against the French satirical weekly newspapers, the Charlie Hebdo, when terrorists killed 17 people and 11 others were injured. As you all know, Charlie Hebdo is a satirical magazine that features cartoon, reports, debates, and jokes that are strongly non-conformist. And in the past, Charlie Hebdo had attracted international attention for its controversial depiction of Prophet Mohammed, and it was mostly considered as a principal motive of the January massacre in 2015. We decided to build this archive for many reasons. The terrorist attacks against the Charlie Hebdo really sparked a very vigorous debate about fundamental political and ethical issues such as the freedom of expression, the relation between state, religion, and society, respect for other beliefs and perspective, inequality, and also the disenfranchisement of individuals and community. Participants in this debate represent a wide range of political position and social background. Though the events and subsequent social protests were concentrated in France, extensive media coverage drew global attention. The slogan "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie, was posted on Twitter by Joachim Ronsen just 1 hour after the attack, and it went viral. He created this image because he lacked words to express himself. His slogan was intended to evoke solidarity with the victims, and as other phrases such as "I am," "we are," express empathy, outrage, and horror by subsuming ourselves into victims' identity. "Je suis Charlie" trended at the top of the Twitter hashtag the day of the attack. By the following afternoon, it had appeared more than 3-4 million times, and it was used nearly 6,000 times per minute. By Friday, it had appeared more than 5 million times. Counter hashtag also appeared as expression of disagreement with the unconditional support for Charlie Hebdo. The hashtag Je ne suis pas Charlie was used by those who accused the magazine of racism. News media also used the slogan Je ne suis pas Charlie to discuss why they chose not to publish any Charlie Hebdo cartoons as part of their news reporting. So as a result, our archive that we created at Harvard, the main objective was to document a peculiar moment in the 21st century when the word Charlie and also those two slogans, Je suis Charlie, je ne suis pas Charlie, I am Charlie, I am not Charlie, all of a sudden took on a tragic significance and become charged with conflicting emotion, opinions, and agendas. From a library perspective, the most important part of this project, it was to document this moment in history in an objective way, to collect both sides, to collect the positions for Charlie and also against Charlie. It was also very important for us to realize that we need to collect in a moment, collecting here and now. This project was also very strongly supported by our faculty at Harvard, who increasingly incorporate primary and distinctive, unique and difficult to find primary sources into their teaching and learning. And just to illustrate what we have in the archive, what illustrates the civil debate that happened after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France and internationally, you can see illustration from traditional marches, since after the Charlie Hebdo tragedy on January 11, 2015, about 2 million people, including more than 40 world leaders, met in Paris for a rally of national unity, and almost 4 million people joined demonstration across France and in many cities internationally. So we have donations from individuals from France documenting that particular moment in history. The Charlie Archive also documents all marches and tribute to the victim of the attack in many cities in France and internationally. Another example, street arts. Je suis Charlie slogan showed up all over the world in street art and graffiti, especially in Paris, as a tribute to victims of the terrorist attacks. Artists painted tributes, murals, and the slogan all over the city to remember the victims. Many artists contacted Harvard and donated their art and their content to the archive. Another examples, numerous cartoonists in France and internationally created arts, different cartoons and caricatures using the slogan Je suis Charlie or Je ne suis pas Charlie. Others use this in combination with pictures of the deceased. This type of content was also donated to the archive, and you can find it in the archive. Finally, we have also a lot of personal narratives, including songs, poetry, and all of that was donated from individuals from France and from many countries. Donation came from persons that needed to react to what happened and express themselves in various ways. Many of these personal expressions have been collected directly on the street of Paris or many other French cities, as they were using during the social protests, during the demonstrations and marches. Finally, we have many other examples of in the collection that reflects very strongly and in many cases tells very unique personal stories. For instance, just to give you one example, this lady was asked by the French newspapers La Libération to describe how she remembered Charlie Hebdo. And after the attack, she was so emotional that she simply couldn't do it. She didn't know how to express herself. So she simply took all of issue of the Charlie Hebdo that she had in her apartment in Paris. It was more than 1,000 issues, and she put it everywhere in her apartment to reflect her emotional state. Then she took this picture and she sent it to the newspaper La Libération, and she also sent that picture to the Charlie archive to document that moment, that particular moment. So if you would like, you can see many other examples from this collection on our official Charlie Archive landing page. Collection is currently in the processing, but it will be available to the entire world via the Harvard Library websites. Thank you very much.
History professor at Temple University, and I don't conserve things, but I write about history, and I've done a lot of research into protest movements in the United States, and these are the three books that I have done over the last couple of years. Dissent, the History of an American Idea is basically a narrative history of the United States from the standpoint of dissent and protest. Dissent in America on the left is a reader of documents by dissenters from Roger Williams all the way up to the present. And then recently Make Art Not War, which is a book of some of the posters that are in the Tamiment collection at New York University Library. And basically, my thesis and what I've done, and this all got started because I teach a course at Temple University called Dissent in America, and you'll probably be all happy to know that it's a pretty popular course. Students are, I guess when you're 18, 19, 20 years old, you're a natural-born dissenter anyway. But the events, really ever since September 11th, there's been a rise in protest, and now, of course, one of the silver linings in this last election is that protest has been really energized in a very big way. But the basic thesis that I had in the course and in writing the books is that dissent is central to American history. In fact, the United States was born out of dissent. In the 17th century, you had religious dissenters, Quakers, Puritans, coming to the New World and setting up colonies. You had in the 18th century political dissenters eventually raising their protest to the level by the 1760s and 70s into a revolution and overthrowing, becoming independent. And then when we got around to writing a constitution, we put the right to dissent in the very first amendment to the Constitution. And basically Americans haven't shut up since. We've protested against everything. Abolitionists protesting against slavery in the 19th century, women protesting for the right to vote, workers protesting for the right to organize and unionize. By the time you get to the 20th century, the whole proliferation, of dissent movements from civil rights to anti-Vietnam War, LGBTQ rights, environmentalism, American Indian movement, Chicano movement, so many different things that we were just kind of inundated with this in the last few years even. And not only that, but every single war in American history has had protesters against it. Even the American Revolution, even the Civil War, and on both sides in the Civil War, you had Southerners protesting against the Confederates, and you had people in the North protesting against Lincoln's waging of the war. And World War I had huge anti-war protests to it, and of course this is where the Espionage and Sedition Acts were put into effect, which still are on the books. This is some of the things that some of the whistleblowers have been imprisoned over because these anti-sedition acts have been passed ever since World War I. And one of the first victims of that was Eugene V. Debs. Some of you perhaps know how he was arrested in 1918 for giving an anti-war speech and wound up spending several years in prison, including 1920 when he conducted his entire presidential campaign from a prison cell. And one of the things that we discuss in my classes and also the teach-ins. I've been running teach-ins at Temple University on Friday afternoons, and students come and we look at some contemporary issue and look at the historical context, and it becomes clear that this idea about dissent, about protest, is really in our DNA. And it always irritated me back in the Vietnam War, and it's irritated me since, all the time. Since then as well, when I hear people complaining about protesters, calling them un-American, unpatriotic. Well, I don't think there's anything more American than protest. It is kind of one of the supreme expressions of patriotism. Is that when you love your country, you want your country to do the right thing. You want your country to live up to its ideal of itself. And I think so much about protest is that, we were brought up, and a lot of you are probably roughly my age too, and when I was a kid in the 50s, we were taught all the time that the United States is the greatest country in the world. And I loved it that I was born in the greatest country in the world. I thought this was the most wonderful thing. And then you turn on the television, you see 9 black students being escorted into Little Rock Central High School with the 101st Airborne protecting them. and something doesn't gel about that image, then what doesn't gel is that, well, if we live in the greatest country in the world, because everybody's free and equal, why do these kids need this protection to go to school? And I think this was one of the seeds of the 1960s protests, that this generation felt that, well, this is the greatest country, but let's make sure it lives up to what it says. Let's make the reality more closely resemble the ideal. And this, to me, is what protest is all about. And then, of course, there are many ways people express protest: marching in the street, art, music, protest songs, poetry. I mean, this is just one of the many, many expressions of that Central American trait. Thank you.
Allow us to introduce ourselves. We are the 99%. We are getting kicked out of our homes. We are forced to choose between groceries and rent. We are denied quality medical care. We are suffering from environmental pollution. We are working long hours for little pay and no rights if we're working at all. We are getting nothing while the other 1% is getting everything. We are the 99%. These were the words that kicked off the 99% project in August 2011. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about Occupy Wall Street and the preservation of its heritage and how it speaks to our time. Sometimes we're talking about a meme. Sometimes we're talking about a medium. And at other times we're talking about a movement in the making. I argue that Occupy was more than a meme and something less than a movement in and of itself. Rather, it was a moment in a longer arc of mobilization which extends to the present, not my president, etc. But at the time, it was something of a novel experiment within the laboratory of Lower Manhattan, filled as it was with creatures such as these and these. I'm going to come back to those in a second. As an occupation of urban space, it was premised on a readily replicable repertoire of dissent and disobedience, already battle-tested in other places, from Tahrir Square in Cairo to Puerta del Sol in Madrid. It was also an artifact of social and political practice. And as an artifact, it also lent itself to a kind of kaleidoscope of interpretations, each one colored by varieties of lived experience, critical theory, and political ideology. Its most viral images, this among them, worked when they worked within the framework of a platform within which many other platforms could fit. One that would make space for a multiplicity of messages, identities, and ideologies that constituted the so-called 1% and 99% against the 1%. And this platform contained the rules for its own reproduction. These rules were deceptively simple in their conception. Take this square, share this meme, use this hashtag, use this graphic, but they were inevitably more complex in their execution. The quixotic call to action was accompanied by a striking image of a ballerina poised on the back of the charging bull, a picture of grace and levity in the face of 1% power, as they called it. Behind the ballerina and the bull stood a line of black bloc, with which we have become familiar again, wading through a cloud of tear gas. Above it all, a simple question: what is our one demand? Below it, a pithily worded invitation, hashtag Occupy Wall Street, September 17th, bring tent. I don't know if you could see it at the bottom there, bring tent. Everything else, from how to make decisions to what demands, if any, to make, they ended up making none and demanding everything. Everything else was left to the occupiers to decide for themselves. I'm going to show you a few images of mine that went viral at the time and in subsequent years, simply to illustrate the point that everyone was, in some sense, a participant observer. Everyone was a documentarian. Everyone was an archivist, in a sense, within the context of the 99% movement. So in the course of this decision-making, art-making, and movement-making process, the occupiers would find new ways to encode and encrypt the anti-politics and anti-capitalism of Occupy Wall Street in a new narrative and visual language, one that could be comprehended, copied, and ultimately co-opted by almost anyone. Here we see the pop-up gallery of grievances that arose from day one along Broadway in the space of the occupied square. And here we also see in the process the reinscription of power relations of the larger society. And these power relations, I argue in my book, were reproduced also within the occupation and within its artwork. The relations, for example, between white occupiers and occupiers of color, between cis male-bodied and trans participants, between homeowners and homeless itinerants, between citizens and undocumented immigrants, and so on. And these power-laden social relations were then reproduced by the culture industry by way of platforms at once physical and virtual, vertical and horizontal, corporate and anti-corporate. Each event was heavily mediated from beginning to end as story and a spectacle from day one on, passing through a chain of media production, consumption, and circulation. Each story filtered first through the lenses of the live streamers, videographers, and photographers, present company among them, who would generate the raw material, upload it to the mobile web, then project it into the online ether. The raw material would then be refined and reposted, mixed and remixed, along with the obligatory running commentary, by social media consumers and producers, spreading the occupations across space and time by way of likes, retweets, links, and shares. Subsequently, the story and the spectacle would be selectively picked up and published, usually for profit, by the media industry, also pictured here. Finally, the coverage would be aggregated, ranked, and archived by way of the algorithms and the search engines, or as one might call them, search and destroy engines, since much is also destroyed in the process. Herein lies what I think may be the most daunting challenge for those whose task is to preserve the objects created by such social actors. How to decommodify, disaggregate, and reappropriate these objects for the quote-unquote 99% for whom they were originally intended and to whom they were addressed. How to reproduce, reorder, and represent them in ways that do not reify or fetishize them, but that transmit the visual texts in the context of their historical moment, their internal contradictions, and in all their complexity and their multiplicity of meanings. So the occupations of 2011 to 2012 tended to follow a more or less predictable sequence. The initial take being planned by a hardcore of seasoned activists aimed at peaceably but forcefully confronting, disrupting, and delegitimizing quote-unquote business as usual, while projecting the narratives of the 99% and counter-narratives to those of the so-called 1% by way of the spectacle they produced in the course of this confrontation. When their actions incited overreaction from local law enforcement, as they inevitably did, and later from federal agencies, the events would be captured and circulated, then seen and heard by diffuse networks of sympathizers. The participation of the many, although it had its basis in prior grievances, was invariably catalyzed by the viral imagery of police violence. And it's appropriate that there's a soundtrack here because there always was down at Zuccotti. It should be noted that given New York City's history of police violence and its then government's antipathy toward unpermitted protest, Occupy was originally expected, even intended to be ephemeral, even if its impact was intended to endure and to outlive it. Many participants described its impact in mythical, allegorical, or dreamlike language, or alternatively, in the language of an awakening, of becoming conscious, or of seeing that which had been unseen pre-Occupy. This very visibility, however, was contingent on a set of material, social, and political conditions, and dependent on the physical presence of an occupation. For the occupiers, this was never about pure aesthetic value or exchange value. It was also about the social and political use value of the occupied space and the Occupy story, which continues to present its uses and abuses today. Ultimately, the ephemerality of Occupy was enforced at the point of a baton, and at times at the point of a less lethal gun. Much of its material memory, its original archives, were destroyed in the process of the evictions. As the police wagons moved out with their quarry of Aristides, the dump trucks moved in, and they disposed of everything the occupiers left behind, along with the tents, tarps, tables, documents, laptops. There were also some 3,000 books and thousands of works of art. For many an occupier, all that was left after November 15th was the digital archive, and even this has been partly lost to the passage of time and the amnesia that is endemic to the digital public sphere. We return to Zuccotti Park with the second challenge posed to those who would like to see its artistic production preserved. How to represent and reconstruct Occupy in its totality, not in the form of a simple gallery of grievances, nor of penned-in repositories of protest past, but rather as a point of departure for new modes of social consciousness and new models of social praxis, recalling the words of this once invisible generation scrawled on the walls of Athens and Manhattan in 2011, "We are an image from the future." Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I was invited, I was immediately thinking of something. I was immediately thinking of Joseph Beuys. Joseph Beuys, a post-war, very involved artist in political. There was no social media, but there was a lot of protest, and I grew up in Bonn, in the capital, former capital of Germany. So every weekend there was a protest. On May 1st, which is our Labor Day, May 1st, usually the unions are celebrating their deeds, their work, and Beuys went to the Karl Marx Platz, where all parties, the Trotskyists, the Leninists, the communists, they were all gathering, but then they would go in different directions and they would leave their leaflets behind. So Joseph Beuys and a couple of his friends, they took a broom and these plastic bags, and they collected all the leaflets, all the schnapps bottles, all the cobblestones, all the garbage, everything from all these ideologies, from all these parties, and put it in into the gallery of René Bloch, who was also an artist and a critic. And then in the evening, he invited the demonstrators to come to the gallery and to speak about their ideas and their dreams, and to actually to collect all these ephemera, which are now in this vitrine, and to not to wipe them off the table, he said, but to think about them and to discuss them, which I think today is also very important, not to wipe them away with your ideology, but to discuss all kinds of aspects. So this was just my first idea of protest art. My second thought was I recently heard a conservation report on the graffiti of this on this Berlin Wall, and so the conservator was very careful gluing back the loose particles, and then I thought I grew up in Germany, which was divided into East and West Germany, and for me, this is political material, it's social material. It's not just about paint, like graffiti paint. It's not an artwork, and it's a very important part of our upbringing, of the world politics. And if you see, like this little insert on the right side, you see the West was all painted with graffiti, and the East was blank. And to put like a piece of the Berlin Wall with the east side towards the wall, I thought it was just ridiculous. So I think my point here is that as conservators, we have to not only work on surfaces, but we have to work on the power of the material that we are being given. And we also have to make sure that the wall will remain a wall and not just be a decoration for another wall. So this is now in a lobby of a famous construction company in New York, and I think to value the emptiness of the eastern side of the wall is as much important as to value the decorative spray paint on the front side. In 1988, David Hammons was invited to participate in a public art project. So he put up the image of Jesse Jackson with blonde hair and blue eyes onto a scaffold in aluminum. He painted it, and then and as you can see on the left side, it was set up randomly or not by a crew of white people, and a few hours after it was set up, it was smashed down, and so this is how it looked after some people with sledgehammers like tore it down, and they were very angry about it. That was in Washington, D.C. And so this is now, it's actually in a private collection now, but it was on view here at the Queen's Museum, and you can see he actually used the impact from the sledgehammer, and he said now the work is complete. Like before it was not really his work, but now the work is complete, so he made this little fence of sledgehammers, and the second from the left, he put this lucky strike wrapping around it to say, oh, this was a lucky strike, that this work is now much better than it was before. And then, so one day he called, David Hammonds called me and said, can you help me? I tried to restore my own painting, and it didn't work out. It's actually harder than I thought. And so he did all these fillings with some enamel paint, and then he just thought, let's not continue to do this. So this is in his studio, and then we agreed to take it out in our studio, and he came back actually every day almost, and then we decided what do we actually restore. So what is part of the impact and what is part of the natural wear and use. So as a conservator, we had to basically distinguish between damage and, well, between insignificant damage and significant damage. So, and I think that's a very fine line. It's a very exciting line. That's why I'm conservator, because it's really. And then on the left side you see the unrestored work, and on the right side you see the restored work. And you will not believe, but we had multiple discussions with David, who wanted to make it a little bit more beautiful, and then we, like every little chip we discussed, is this part of the work or is it not part of the work? So I think what I want to say is that as a conservator, you seem to be very conservative, and you have to be very conservative, but also you want to, first of all, you don't want to freeze life. You don't want to freeze a moment. You want to tell a story. You want to help future generations to understand what has happened. And I think it is very important to understand the entire context of what you are dealing with to be able to make this story available.
So we can, and then there's a mic that's going to be going around the audience. If anyone wants to start with a question. Is there anyone? If not, okay. One of the things I think perhaps we should expand upon is Greg, is your talk about the life cycle of works that are created for protest or social activism. And the whole idea that things that are made as sort of a sometimes very thought through, become museum objects, become the source of history. And if anyone wants to kind of take from there the idea of life cycle. And artists, feel free to participate. Does anyone, Greg?
I thought Christian's point about sort of using the objects to tell the story ties into that question, because obviously you could tell a very different story where you make the narrative in a different direction. But my point about life cycle is that these are continuous, that the fine art tradition and the ephemeral tradition are actually have a continuity, they connect to each other. But we often feel the need to break it off at a certain point in order to establish one hierarchically above the other.
I mean, I'm curious because for you as a historian, these become the raw material of study. So how do you do, I guess what gets saved becomes what is known to study.
Yeah, and of course that's the case with all historical artifacts. What we know about Abraham Lincoln, for example, we have letters, but we only have the letters that were saved, and speeches, things that were written out that didn't get lost over time. So basically, history, generally speaking, is always a bit of a crapshoot. And you try to reconstruct the best analysis of all of this as you can from what is available. I think it was very interesting with the Jesse Jackson picture, with the fact that it was destroyed says so much more about it than the actual original construction of it. And then, of course, by doing this with the sledgehammers, you're saying so many different things about this piece of art. The same thing with the Berlin Wall. The other side, the eastern side, is just as important. In fact, maybe even more important than the graffitied side, because that really says an awful lot about what was going on in eastern Germany, and that basically the people who tried to approach the wall from the eastern side were basically shot. And so that a paintbrush or a spray can never even could possibly get near. So that tells a completer story. Let's put it that way. Still not the whole story.
We're open up to anyone else who wants to take off. So,
Well, I would just add, in doing like Black Lives collecting, for example, some of the things that I look for, well, photography is a little simpler because you look for iconic images, or you look for images that may not have become iconic, but you sort of question why. So, there are going to be flashpoints, for example, that would have been captured by a photographer, or, there's a story that's promoted by the media, but this one photographer was there and actually photographed a very different perspective, showing a community coming together to clean up. In fact, the image that I showed with the Patrick Campbell flag and the gentleman wearing the T-shirt, well, that was a line that had been created between, as a buffer between the community and the people, and they were trying to get the two sides from fighting because they didn't want the community destroyed any further, and they wanted people to start talking. You really didn't hear those kinds of stories, or you didn't hear the stories about police officers who were out in the street protesting as well, or who spoke up as well. So looking for photographs that represent that. As well as the other, as many different stories as possible. But for me, it's like trying to find those iconic moments. The casket, the mirror casket, we collected the photograph from Zun Lee as well as the casket because they represented something very, and the casket was actually created by an artist collective, which was also important to us as well. So looking for those iconic images. And I also say that in terms of getting a better sense of what represents a historical moment at the current time, it's not, I was an art curator before specifically being a history photography curator. And it's the same thing in many ways that you might look for with art. You look for the paradigmatic shifts. So you ask yourself the question, or history is the same way. How does this moment, how does Picasso represent a paradigmatic shift? How does Romare Bearden represent a shift in art somehow? How does the March on Washington represent a shift in history? So you look for those paradigmatic shifts as they're happening, and then you look for objects that represent those shifts.
I actually have a question for Michael. Michael, I was wondering, when you talked about Occupy Wall Street and the fact that so much was destroyed and lost, what went out or what is going out or what is happening to pull in or reproduce materials so that there is some sort of an archive of them? And are you working with anyone specifically to do that and accomplish that?
Thanks for that question. So when the archive, as it existed within the square, was destroyed, there was kind of a proliferation of archives across the city. I think similar processes unfolded in Oakland and Chicago and elsewhere. And what happened immediately after was a conflict over how the images, the stories would be represented and reconstructed. So there actually was a split between those who thought you needed an archive, as they called it, anarchic archive that was DIY, that was basically open to anybody to produce and to reproduce and to remix, and a more formal process of documenting the protests, and this became the Interference Archive in Brooklyn. And my role was not to decide definitively what was going to be archived or not, but I received quite a few materials in the course of writing this book, and I had to decide what was going to make it in and what was not. So, in that sense, there was a process of recovery of the materials that were destroyed that went into my research, that went into the research of many other people who were similarly trying to understand this moment in history. And there was also a proliferation of found objects. People went to the sanitation department, they went to NYPD precincts. There was some recovery of the objects themselves as well. So that was a kind of process that unfolded over 5 years and is still continuing today.
Can I just clarify something? Yeah, Interference Archive actually existed before, but the work went in there because it was Dara Greenwald and Josh McPhee's collection that established it.
Sir, someone in the audience, I believe, has a comment about this?
So I had several questions that relate to many of these, partly to Amber's question, but then to some of the presentations. And as a conservator, I see both sides. When do we continue to collect all of the material, or as much of the material as we can, when we know that storage and providing the right environment and being able to exhibit it are going to be one side of the coin, and then the other side of the coin, if now we have so much available in terms of digital collection or photography, so that the Lincoln letters would all be there if they're saved. So when do we let go of the materiality? When do we realize that we need that to make it real, to make it truthful, that people want an exhibition of the item? You said you collected the coffin as well as the photograph, but the photographs become more and more important or emotional. They go viral. So I'm really at a quandary there in terms of where we go, what do we do, where do we put resources that are limited?
I would say it's a little different for a history museum or any museum, but particularly for a history museum than it might be for an archive. Because in a history museum, you're not collecting for future research necessarily. If I'm doing research on the civil rights movement, I would like to have access to as much information as I possibly can from the Johnson administration, for example. But with our museum, it wasn't necessarily about, there are millions of photographs related to Black lives out there. I was looking specifically for the ones that represented shifts, that represented metaphors from which I could tell a larger story. And so I wasn't trying to collect as many as possible. It was like, that casket's important. Let's get the casket, I'll find a photograph. Devin Allen's photo on the cover of Time magazine. Devin Allen becomes important because he democratizes media. So now we don't have to get the story from television news. We can now get the story from some 20-something-year-old who's out in the street taking photographs as they're happening and putting them up on the internet as they're happening. So then he becomes an important photographer for me to represent in the collection. And I look for his narrative as represented and changes in the narrative as represented through his photographs. So I'm not collecting all several thousand. I'm looking for the ones that are most important to telling this particular story and telling Devin Allen's story. And that's how I select, essentially.
Just to add to that from a strictly library perspective, archival perspective, I think that the future of the collecting is going to be really a work that we're going to do in collaboration with scholars, in collaboration with researchers, because very often we realize that what we see from our library perspective, it might be what our researchers will want. So for us, for example, for the Charlie Hebdo collection, this is that we did. We involved our faculty from many departments across Harvard, and mostly the Romance language department. Those faculty were involved in the curatorial oversight. They provided intellectual and curatorial oversight to ensure that what we collect will serve in the future for research, and it's going to be a representative slice of the content that exists and that we can archive. And in addition to that, I think that what is important to notice is that if we talk about collecting internationally, it's only a tiny slice that reaches our institutions. So in any way, we are already operating with universe of the documents or of the objects. That is really, that it's not everything. We are not working with the entire universe. So then after that, we can add the layers of the selectivity to create collections that are representative. And if we have that collaboration with faculty, I think that that's something that will matter more and more in the future.
Oh, yes, was someone?
I was relating a lot to what. I never really need one of these. I was relating a lot to what you were talking about with the David Hammond's piece in terms of the wear and tear and the use value of the artwork and the ephemeral aspects of it in terms of costuming and posters and the ephemera that gets used in protest. I mean, recently, the Missile Dick Chicks just got back together, and they changed their sort of costume just a little bit. Like they are painting the missiles gold instead of silver. They're painting their faces like Trump, and they've been recruiting and reforming in a different type of group. And so for me, they asked me, "Oh, we need all the missiles back?" And I was like, "No, you can't have my missile back." And they were like, "Well, are you going to paint it gold and join us?" And I said, "I don't know about that either. Like, I have my costume from that time frame, and, I'm archiving that. Like, I feel attached to that as part of my history." But I understood and appreciated what they had to say about the fact that, as a collective who's re-examining their mission back then and seeing the connections between that mission then and the changes and the things that are happening now, they want those objects to be used, and I go through that with my own costuming as well. Sometimes I show my costumes as part of an art exhibit, and my gallery might hold on to it, and I feel strange when I feel activated towards that object again. Like my wig from Ghost Bitch is at my gallery right now. I'm going to pick it up this week because I need it for golden showers. So it's like it's not dead to me because this ephemera is being used for a specific purpose. So I feel like that has something to do with all protest art in some way, that there's that utility aspect to the work.
Utility and also kind of an organic thing. A couple of years ago, I taught a course in Derry in Northern Ireland about the Troubles and the peace process, and it was very interesting looking at the murals. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the Derry artists and the mural artists, but every once in a while they paint over it, and it's a new mural, and so it changes all the time. Even though so in a sense, the only way to archive that is the photography of it when it was originally done. But some of those murals have 2 or 3 different layers on them already.
The very existence of this conference is sort of the apotheosis of awareness of protest art. So if we look back at when Tony Shafrazi wrote All Lies Kill on Picasso's Guernica, early 70s, at the Museum of Modern Art, as a protest against the My Lai massacre. And of course, it was removed immediately, and I don't think I've ever even seen a photo of that moment. So I have several questions here. One is, because it belongs to an art museum, that had to be removed and forgotten as soon as possible. If it had been in a history museum, would that paint be left on as part of the historical record of what happened and the My Lai massacre? But maybe now in 2017, if that happened again, would it be left on, or only if the painting were in a history museum?
Yeah, I know what you mean, and that brings the purpose of being a conservator to the edge of their ethics. I think conservators are, in the first place, there to preserve artworks and to document everything that happens to the artwork. But the artwork, in the first place, is an artwork, and it's not responsible for the reaction that it causes. Although Tony Shafrazi, he was not against Picasso, but he was against maybe the trustees at MoMA. So I think that's a different thing, and as a conservator, I think you have to be very true to your profession, which is not always to remove everything, but to, basically to protect the artwork.
Joyce, I think the question is interesting in the sense that it seems it's about different kinds of filters. And, Michael was saying that in a way there were these two camps coming out of Occupy, one saying that it should be a kind of DIY, it should be a living archive, a kind of surplus of information without a narrative thread necessarily, not a single narrative thread, I guess multiple narrative threads that are possible or evolving, right? Whereas the museum and the institutional art world is about constructing, a fairly continuous canonical narrative that you don't deviate from. Or if you deviate from, you have to do it in specific ways. And I think we've reached a point, kind of like physicists have about maybe considering the multiverse, right? Where, the only way to explain sort of physics is to say that every second things are branching off into new possibilities. But we've reached a point where there's just so much accumulation of stuff, and it comes back to your question, I think, that maybe we need a potlatch, at a certain point you need to just say, destroy it all, and restart it as another set of gifts towards the culture that is. And maybe the photograph is the only way it should continue, or a digital archive. I don't know.
Hi, I'm Laura McCann. I work at New York University Libraries. I'm the head of the conservation lab there.
You have the Repo History archive.
Yes, I have a number of things. This past month, I actually just rehoused the queer spaces, and I'm also trying to come up with long-term housing for some of the other street works that you guys did. I also just came up with a whole plan for how to deal with the AWS, OWS, and the Jeremy Gould collections, which are both Occupy. And I also work with a lot of performance artists' archives, so y'all, and your materials when they come in. And I have so many questions for you all. This is great. Of course, the Taniment posters, which we've worked on. So thank you for this panel. I'll take over now. You're all going to stay a little longer. I think I have a couple questions. One, I'll kind of focus on Occupy because that's where my mind has been. We had an assessment done. We're doing a lot of plans, and there's a lot of discussion about it. And some of it is about, we are a research library, and we exist in that capacity to serve the needs of our community, which is primarily, of course, the faculty, students, but it's also, of course, associated members, and the Taniment Library is open to the general public. So why? How do we serve this material? Some of the material is easier to serve. especially sort of the working documents, which are these large Post-its. I have to deal with the thing of how do I deal with these Post-its that are falling off, and that's the fun conservation challenge. But when you have all these protest signs, we have a lot of problems because of the fact that a lot of it came from sanitation. Most of our collection did come from sanitation, so there's an incredible amount of organic debris, really problematic. But it's a reading room based on libraries and archives. So having all these signs, how do we store them? Most of them would really benefit from art storage. We're looking into that. Do we photograph them all and really have that be the primary way? Is that, and often my curators, my librarians and archivists are coming to me asking me what I think. I kind of push it back to them because in the end it's about the researchers. So I would be curious about that. I'm also curious about your thoughts with the Occupy, and also a lot of times with some of the performance art collections that we get in, and I say performance art, they're usually also visual artist collections that come into downtown. We get parts of costumes, or we have part of the giant squid from Occupy. And these are they don't necessarily, they speak to what they were if we have the photographic evidence, but they're really parts of it. And how do we approach the sort of conservation of that? Do you have ideas about that? I'll leave it at that to start with. But I'd love to hear from everybody.
Michael, do you want to start since you were occupied?
Well, I wasn't occupied. I think, I think they would take issue with my formulation if I were saying that. But I think the use value for the present and future of these objects, whether or not they're complete or whether or not they're in parts or scattered as they were across the city and then reassembled, I think that in part it embodies or embeds what happened, right, in the art itself. So the fact of its destruction, the fact of Occupy's forcible eviction, the fact that it was kind of ushered very quickly off the stage of history, but not out of people's consciousness. I think all of that is important for people to be able to retain and to be able to engage with. So I don't know about the conservation challenges in a practical sense, but I think in a social and political sense, it's perhaps less of a challenge than we might think. In part because this is the history, this is the legacy. It's not only what was created, it was also what was destroyed. And I think that speaks to future possibilities also. It speaks to future movements, and that is the responsibility of all of us who do research or who do conservation work, I think, to speak to that future as well as to the past and the artwork that it was.
Jim?
Yeah, I'm interested because Marvin Taylor, who of course runs the Fails, is Dubois, I guess. I brought a group of students there, and he would basically let people touch things and pick them up and handle them. And he said, this is kind of atypical of archivists. And he said he even had some archivists in at one point, and they were very upset with him doing that. Josh McPhee and the folks at Interference are even more so. I mean, they only have, I think, a few things that they keep out of reach, but everything else you can pick up, you can practically tear pages out of it and do what you want. I wouldn't go that far. But it's very much the idea of it's in use, that these are things that are in use and they have a life. They're not dead things that should be preserved under plexiglass, but they're actually in circulation. And maybe that natural wearing down is like the patina that we so admire on certain artworks or whatever, or the hammer blows to the piece that Kristen was talking about. Maybe that's just inevitable. Maybe it grinds down, and you already have a dirty archive, so maybe it just gets dirtier, right?
Yeah, I think preservation is the right word in this case. I would not feel comfortable to restore like these artifacts. So if you can keep them in a dry storage, I mean, usually these works are like arte povera, like they're very poor materials, and they don't last very long. And it would be very interesting to preserve, like with a high-tech preservation chamber or something, a few of these works, but just as an exemplar. But in general, I agree, it's something that you would use, and it's an ephemera. But what I thought was equally important than to only preserve all these pamphlets is also to look in Washington, like many people had these clear backpacks. And for me, I mean, I've never seen a clear backpack before, but it reveals so much about our time. And it's not just like we are for this or against this, but also what are the conditions in which we are actually gathering. And I think there's some fear around it, and there's this like all these rules and regulations. And when you have to apply for this march in Washington, there are all these rules. And when I was protesting when I was 16, there was not one. So I think that's also very interesting to preserve.
And just to add from a library perspective, I think that you ask the question, should we digitize those materials? And I think it's something that we really should think about that as archivists, as librarians, mostly because very often you have this type of collections created at many universities by many organizations across the countries, but also internationally. And our scholars very often are thinking how to connect those collections. Sometimes collection like that in isolation doesn't mean anything, only if you will be able to connect those collections, create mega collections internationally. The value, the scholarship value, maybe in the future will be really in that connectivity. So if we don't invest in digitization of this content, we might lose something.
I think we had a question in the back.
Yeah, I have a couple things I want to talk about, but it'll be very short. Aaron brought up the fact that Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and Dubois were all very much into photography, and most people think of them as writers, the first thing, but the awareness of photography was really interesting. But in the light of Occupy Wall Street, and let me give a shout out to the Dixie Missile Chicks. I remember them from 2004 and other places. But there is this whole collection of emails, Facebook pages, and all this really important information that contextualize the images we're talking about, because they don't exist alone. And they're really important. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be collected, but what kind of effort is there to really collect the emails from the anti-globalization movement, Occupy Wall Street, and Black Lives Matter? There is so much communications that and that's why Frederick Douglass came up to me, because of course he wrote so beautifully about what was happening. And to just have the images alone, which are important, I'm a visual artist, without the real contextualization of all the thought, all the arguments. David talked about the arguments and all the different way people are pushing back and forth, but without really having that information, how can we really understand those images?
I think that this is a really important question because very often the visual art is very expressive, but we need this context. We need to contextualize those collections. This is why at Harvard, when we started to build the Charlie Hebdo archive, we really debated how to do it, and we decided that the best way to document what's happened in France at this particular moment, it was to build a composite archive, an archive that will reunite different perspective in different formats, everything that was written about this particular event. So the mainstream content, visual art, different type of pictures, objects. We also did web archiving. We collected mostly blogs and Facebook pages to document all of that holistically, so we are not limiting ourselves into a particular format or to particular type of materials. And I think that, at least from my perspective in academic libraries, this is how we start thinking about this type of collection to make sure that they are holistic and comprehensive. So we collect different type of information. We don't collect around the format, we collect around the concept. It's the concept that guide the selection decision and not the format.
You had a question.
Well, question, comment, I don't know. I'm still deciding because I have such a complicated relationship with institutions, and that's the filter by which we archive most of this stuff. And I wonder, are we, essentially, I've been protesting for 3 years since I've been carrying the white man in my pocket, but that doesn't look like a protest, like an Occupy protest or something with signs or whatever. And sometimes I'm very suspicious of the archivists and what they're looking at, from everything from the composition of the panel, like there's one woman on the panel, there is one person of color on the panel out of this, and but the audience is overwhelmingly women, at least they look cisgender female to me. So I wonder, what are your suspicions as archivists of your point of view? What is your blind spot?
Well, yeah. First of all, I would say if you're concerned about how you're going to be remembered, you need to tell your own story. Every single one of those people up there, Dubois, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, I brought those up because they were there to tell their own story. They said, I'm not going to let some historian tell you what I look like or what I acted like. I'm not going to let you have to worry about getting some caricature or cartoon of me from somewhere. I'm going to take my picture and you will always know what I looked like. And so they were about telling their own story. The same thing with the Black Lives Collecting. I went directly to the photographers and worked with photographers because I wanted them to tell their own story. I think what's really important is that there are going to be people who interpret your story for whatever reason, from whatever perspective. That's the way history is. It's, it fits certain needs, and depending on what function your story fills, and telling that story, that's the function it fills. But if you want to make sure that, we understand what you were thinking, what you were doing with the white man in your pocket, you need to tell that story, and you need to have it archived for yourself so that when it ends up in another archive, then your story is there. And that's particularly important to someone who does, for me as an African-American historian, who's looked through archives and saw how stories were told. But then you look at photographs from black photographers from the Civil Rights Movement, for example, or you hear the story of black people who were there versus what you read in the newspapers, and you see the stories are very different. So that's what I think was important. If you want your story told, you have to be the one to tell it.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for your intervention there, and made me think of the old saying, every way of seeing is a way of not seeing, and I think being very conscious of that and explicit about it is the only way that we can engage with it. I try to both tell my own story and center stories that hadn't really been centered during the occupation itself, and I think it's always a struggle to do that, coming from the subject positions that most authors and artists who've done work since Occupy, about Occupy, have come from. I just want to also highlight your question about what does a protest look like. I don't know if you posed it as a question, but it is a question, right? And I think it's historically emergent, and it's it's in the process of transformation right now. It looks like a white dude in your pocket, or it looks like potentially what would have been called an uprising in previous years, and is now the stuff of everyday protest. So I think thinking about the autonomy of the collector, the storyteller, but also the way in which they're tied to the institutions, the way in which they're tied to the power relations, and having that duality of vision is really important.
There are sort of two quotes by white European men that come to mind. One is Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, the bourgeoisie was the first society to recognize history as an entity, and it also wanted to stop history. Right? And the other is, as calls Walter Benjamin's famous quote, that there's no document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism, which I think is very important to always keep these things in mind, especially in a museum context or an institution.
I think we are tiptoeing around a very uncomfortable question, and that is, let's say a protest or vandalism happens, and I think that was what JayZ was also referring to. Somebody or some institutional body will be in the position or put itself into the position to decide if this is becoming an art because this is a protest, or this is called vandalism because whoever that body is decides that this is the vandalism. Now, after that, that body will also decide if part or the entire effect of whatever happened will be destroyed or not. Whatever we get is what is left. Either the winner or the loser decides what is left or what cannot be destroyed fast enough, let's say. And after that, I think historians as well as conservators have the load on themselves that regardless of how neutral we want to see ourselves, we will belong inevitably either to one or the other category. And I am referring back to you at the corner, yes, because yes, if we look at conservation, art conservation is primarily white, middle-class female. This is my experience coming from the Eastern Bloc. And it is so. We have been trying to change it, and there are some unfortunate aspects which I have to say with the best intent conservation is trying to remedy. But there had been historically a lot of mistreated Inuit and Aboriginal and all kinds of minority objects where people with their best intent tried to get the information, but somehow because they were coming from the other angle, they never really got to the truth, and therefore those artifacts were not treated properly. We know that. And first of all, when we try to treat something or try to look at the history of anything, we really have to examine ourselves honestly, even when we try to be the most neutral possible. From which side do we come? The ruler or the loser? And the amount of information what we have was passed to us from the ruler or from the loser.
There was someone who had a question. Okay, yes, behind you. Let someone else. So one question, then you could go on to a second.
I have a question for Lidia. In terms of the Charlie archive, how did you get the word out? And also, when you got the word out, how did you select where and who you wanted that audience to be? And what won't you take into the archive? What's your process for selecting?
Yes, thank you very much for that question, because that was very important part of this project, to actually get the word out so individuals in France start donating the content that they have. So we actually hired 2 project managers, 2 students. One student from Harvard that was in France doing some research there, and another student that we had, it was an intern from French intern that we had at Harvard, and then she came back to her home institution and she worked for us in that capacity. And we started by creating a website Charlie Hebdo at the Harvard Library website, and we started to publicize that across many media in France. And we were very lucky because we had a few articles that have been published about this fact that Harvard is building that collection by few important newspapers in France. And then article is just started, really, it was viral. After one article, there was few others, and people knew, and they started to donating the content to the archive. And we even had a TV5 Monde that came to do a documentary on that, so also that helped to publicize that event. And in terms of the selecting the content, of course we want to be as objective as possible, but we really benefited from the expertise of our faculty members, mostly from the Romance language department, that helped to decide what to include in the archive and what not to include in the archive.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, hello. I had a comment or a question for you, and also referring back to what Kenya was saying as incorporated into it. I know that you mentioned as part of the Je suis Charlie collection that you included different aspects of that story, and I'm just wondering if you included things like when later on it became Je suis Istanbul, or different cities that had been terrorized and didn't have that kind of media attention to it.
So the project, this particular project, was really focused on the Charlie Hebdo attacks. We didn't do the collecting around other attacks in France and many other cities in Europe, mostly because we were talking to colleagues in many institutions in Europe. And when the Charlie Hebdo attack happened, we were practically the only one who did a big collect of the materials around.
Sure.
There is only few public libraries in France, in small cities such as Saint-Étienne, Rennes, and Toulouse that did similar type of collecting. But for instance, we contacted La Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library, and they didn't do anything. They only did web archiving. So we focused on that. When the other terrorist attack happened in France, in Belgium, and in other countries, the archive of the cities, for example, the city of Paris, they did their own collect. So we decided that we will not duplicate our effort. And
No, but my question really didn't pertain to, like, of course you wouldn't be collecting archives of other terrorist attacks per se, but I did think that it was super interesting when the language of Je suis Charlie was changed to amplify the fact that we don't pay attention as much to terrorist attacks in non-white countries, or predominant countries like France. So then it gets back to what Kenya was saying for me, and it's like, I recently read a really interesting article about the Grammy Awards and Adele winning the award and Beyonce not winning the award. And you clearly see Beyonce telling her story, just as you suggested, right? The idea that you tell your own story, you very specifically tell your own story in Lemonade, right? And then she's on stage pregnant and splendid and taking over the entire show of the Grammy Awards. With her presence, and even Adele trying to address it, maybe not even addressing it enough in her speech. But the article that I saw said, you cannot, white cannot escape whiteness. And it's like, so what she's saying about the blind spot of the predominance of white folks doing conservation is, it is a problematic situation because it is the story being told through your eyes. So I guess that if any one wants to sort of delve into that deeper, I am super interested in knowing how do you problematize your own conservation in terms of dealing with identity and racial issues, and in the case of these days right now, I mean there's so many different aspects of identity that are under attack by the administration right now, the Muslim community, immigrant community as well.
I just have one remark. I think that conservators are best if they conserve their own generation and their own culture. And I would not feel comfortable to restore any Russian icons or African masks or Inuit costumes. And I think, I mean, that's part of the answer to Nora, that I think we need to train more people in their culture if they want to restore their works. And like conservation is not a global desire for everybody. It's not in everybody's culture. Some people, I mean, if you just look at Japan or China, you do not restore any old buildings. You just tear them down and build the second one next to it. And so our superiority in conservation is not applicable to all other cultures. But of course we need more conservation.
Is it on? United States. I've been here for about 7 months now, and I've been here through the very tumultuous time that it's been through. It's been quite something to see this happen, especially because I come from India, which is a country that has just seen Modi go into power, and after 4 years of that, we see Trump go into power here. I was part of student protests in Delhi, and here's the thing, here's the difference in the two movements. Dissent here is a right. Dissent in India is sedition. You can be jailed for it. So a number of my friends in college, we were graduates in college, did go to jail for having much less dramatic protests than any of what we saw today was. So the question of conservation or looking at those protest art there does not even exist, because no institution will willingly take upon itself to preserve that art. You are directly in conflict with the government. In a situation like that, it is not that we do not want the art to be preserved or to be conserved. It's not a cultural conflict, but a governmental conflict. It's a conflict of power. In such a situation where, say, a person or a culture in itself cannot conserve that art, what would any of y'all as conservators in a country that is liberal about this say about conserving or helping conserve those voices there, which are being shushed? I can tell you that it's been quite a struggle to even have some voice in the Indian media, let alone in international media. We've not been seen or heard anywhere. So how do you sort of negotiate this difference between dissent as a right and dissent as sedition and conservation, and the role that it has to play in sort of making sure that these voices are preserved or at least heard in the global context? It is one thing to say that conservation is not part of a culture, but when the community itself is unable to preserve something, how much does the international community owe it to help?
I think you get to the heart of the question of the politics of the archive. And that is, of course, in a way, what this woman brought up before, is that, there is a filter that's put in place, and we could say, well, very expert people decided this was important or that was important, but the structure on which those expert opinions rest is an invisible component of the official archive. What you're talking about is a kind of counter-archive, which is under erasure. And it's the very act of erasure that needs to somehow be put on the table as part of the politics of any archive, because one selects out of that archive a history, a narrative, and discards the other part, sometimes permanently, as in your case. That's the struggle.
I think we can take one more question. Okay. The back.
Well, we have Laura, and then we'll take the one in the back.
My answer.
Out of here by 5.
Okay. My answer to you would be that first we save the people. People are number one, no question but. And after that, whatever is left, we will try to deal with. And the other answer, reinforcing what Christian said, IIC and the conservation community actually actively looking for any kind of people who are not the so-called majority in art conservation. I know one Inuit art conservator, and I know a few others who are not, the typical, but we are actively reaching out, and if anybody has any idea, please contact me, because we are looking for high school students who might be interested in conservation all the way through, anybody, and any individual who would be interested in picking up the knowledge we can offer and then can use it to the best. So this is a very conscientious effort which we are trying to organize now, because I think conservation is very clear about our weak sides, let's say. So that.
There was one question in the back.
Yes, sorry, is this on? My name is Maria Grandinetti. I work at Princeton University Libraries. I'm another library conservator, and I've also worked for archives. When I was at Stanford University, I wanted to talk about there are precedents in some libraries and archives. I don't know how many, but I know that the Hoover Institution was home to archives for governments in exile. I don't know how often that exists, but I know there is a precedent for it, and I think that archives have served this purpose, holding materials for a government or another entity until such time that their owners felt that those materials were safe, and then at that time they were no longer, they were given back to them. So this is another possibility within the archival world.
I think the idea of democratizing your tools and your techniques is very important, but I just want to say, teaching at City University, we have like no budgets. Our students pay fees that are extraordinarily high for them, even though it's relatively low compared to other institutions. So how, and this is, I know we're out of time, but there's something to consider when you propose this democratization of this. You have to think about how do you make that supportable for people who are not financially capable.
We are trying to provide internships and trying to provide a few
Is it a
grants.
paid internship?
Some of it, yes.
I would also say that the Mellon Foundation at one time I know was actually creating a program specifically for conservators, and I think conservators of color, because they were doing the same thing in the curatorial field as well.
I'm sorry to say that at this point we're going to have to stop. It's been a wonderful discussion which could go on much longer, especially as it's gone through on the questions are coming and coming, but I guess it all comes down to everything is a value judgment. I know from my own experience when my parents died 3 years ago and I had to go through what you would consider their archive, and the judgments I made at that moment are not the judgments that I would make today. And if my brother had been going through that, there would have been a very different archive chosen. So it's a very complex question that I don't think is going to have a solution, a definitive answer now or in the future, but it's something that we have to keep at least recognizing that there are value judgments made. Okay, and Amber, would you like to?
Certainly. Well, first I'd like to thank you as our audience for your participation, and thank our panelists, if you'll join me. Bringing a collective viewpoint on a very hot topic. When we first thought of this topic 2 years ago, we had absolutely no idea of the significance, and this is sort of when you look out for interesting topics to have these dialogues about, you never know what's going to be good or not, or how it's going to hit a particular environment, as we've now sort of got the pulse on this, interestingly. And a lot of your questions, I don't want you to feel like they're not going to be heard, because actually, when we play back these recordings, we actually glean ideas for future dialogues. And there were some incredible things brought up during this one. Most importantly, I think training ethnicity, race, culture, how we preserve these things in our cultural heritage, both in protest and the people we're training to do them, where the ownership of those are, how we archive them, how we collect them, how we resurrect things that are lost, perhaps. So some very interesting points, and I want to thank you all for your engagement on that. And I will say that the Met closes at 5:30, but please go and thank you. Stretch your legs. It's been great. Thank you.